Hello everyone, welcome to the Multimedia channel. I want to take this time to thank all the viewers who have been supporting me on my journey. Please keep up the support. And for the new viewers and new subscribers, please do the same. Without wasting time, today we will be talking about historical moments that have been forgotten by the world. Thank you. Number 1. The first female US president. In August of 1914, President Woodrow Wilson lost his wife, Ellen. The following March, he was introduced to widow Edith Galt through a first cousin. As if in love at first sight, Wilson immediately began showering her with gifts and love notes, some of which probed for her opinion on presidential matters. 3 months after their introduction, Wilson proposed his advisor's alarm, and the two were married in December of 1915. Wilson won another term, and his new wife became his constant companion. She attended his meetings, was given access to classified materials, and even filtered his mail. Toward the end of WWII, she accompanied the president to Europe to attend the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Shortly after their return, a stroke left President Wilson paralyzed and bedridden. Instead of encouraging her husband to resign and be replaced by the vice president, Edith took on a number of his duties herself, hiding the extent of his incapacity from the public. From the time of his stroke to the end of his term in 1921, Edith Wilson was the only connection between the president and other officials, filtering all presidential matters and determining what was important enough to be brought to his bedside. Edith Wilson analyzed every message delivered to the president, barred all officials from bringing him business, assisted him in completing any necessary tasks, and naturally influenced domestic and international policy in doing so. Though she did not make any crucial decisions, she was accused of running the country in Wilson's absence, an accusation that she insisted was incorrect up until her death in 1961. Number 2. The West Virginia Coal Wars. In the late 1800s, a war you probably didn't hear about prevailed over West Virginia. This one was between coal miners and the coal companies who employed them. For decades, working in the West Virginia coalfields meant low wages, shoddy tools, and extremely unsafe conditions. Unionizing was out of the question due to strict contracts that called for immediate termination and eviction for those who lived in company towns of any employees found to be union members. In 1920, the United Mine Workers Union succumbed to local pressure to organize in the area, starting with Mingo County. Thousands of county miners joined, and inevitably, the miners were fired. Those who lived in company-owned homes were greeted by private detectives hired by the coal company to enforce eviction. At one point that May, a dozen of these detectives entered the town of Matwan for this purpose. They first attempted to bribe the mayor to place machine guns on the roofs of town buildings, which the mayor obviously refused. The detectives then set about their duty, but instead of peacefully evicting the families, forced them out of their homes at gunpoint. Hearing reports of this behavior, the town police chief, Sid Hatfield, confronted the group and declared that they were under arrest. A gunfight ultimately ensued, and 10 men were killed, including the mayor. This Matwan massacre bolstered the pro-union cause throughout the county. Over the next several months, those for and against unionization engaged in what was essentially guerrilla warfare, culminating at times in shootouts, ambushes, and assassinations. The war reached its peak on August 1, 1921, when Sid Hatfield of Matwan massacre fame was killed while walking into a courthouse. Local miners were outraged, and thousands of pro-union activists resolved to march on the coal companies of Mingo County. Receiving word that the miners would pass through his town, an anti-union sheriff gathered an army of 3,000 state police. Together, they set up trenches around the nearby Blair Mountain. On August 28, 10,000 Union men approached the ambush, and the largest armed insurrection in the United States since the Civil War ensued. It was not until September 4, when federal troops arrived on the orders of President Warren G. Harding, that the battle finally came to an end. More than 20 Union men were charged with treason, and hundreds were indicted for murder, though nearly all were acquitted in the end. Workers' rights to organize would not be legally recognized until the next decade, with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation. Number 3. The time the government intentionally poisoned alcohol. By the early 1900s, the idea of a nationwide prohibition of alcohol had become a significant matter of debate in Congress. When the United States entered World War I, proponents of prohibition in Congress, outnumbering the opposition 140 to 64, saw a new justification for a national alcohol ban. Limiting the production of alcohol would allocate more resources. In June of 1917, Nationwide prohibition of alcohol was proposed as a constitutional amendment and ultimately passed in both houses by December. Though it supposedly had wartime intentions, the amendment was not ratified until after the war had concluded in January 1919. Regardless, the prohibition of alcohol was added to the U.S. Constitution as the 18th Amendment, banning the production and sale but not consumption of intoxicating liquors. To outline the penalties for violating the new amendment, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act over President Woodrow Wilson's veto. The act effectively banned all liquor, wine, and beer in the country, and the United States went dry on January 17, 1920. Americans found increasingly creative ways to undermine the 18th Amendment and the National Prohibition Act. One method employed by alcohol bootleggers was to steal industrial alcohols which had not been banned and resell them as beverages. This practice became so prevalent an estimated 60 million gallons were stolen annually by the mid-1920s that the Treasury Department ordered manufacturers to poison industrial alcohols with additives, creating denatured alcohol to discourage consumption. When bootlegging chemists found ways to renatured the alcohol, even deadlier poisons like methanol were added, and regulations on denatured alcohol increased. The intentional poisoning by the U.S. government of industrial alcohols led to the paralysis and death of thousands of drinkers who had bootlegged their beverages. One particular concoction made from industrial alcohol, Ginger Jake, was reportedly responsible for crippling up to 100,000 American drinkers. All in all, it is estimated that approximately 10,000 people were killed by drinking denatured alcohol during this time period. Number 4. The mid-century onion debacle. In finance, a future is a financial contract that allows buyers to purchase a commodity at some point in the future for a price that is set today. The buyer in this instance obviously hopes that the price will go up, meaning they purchased at a lower price, while the seller hopes the price will go down. Shorting, as some of us may have learned a few months ago with the GameStop market controversy, is when a futures seller sells borrowed futures, hoping that when it comes time to pay the owner, the price of the future will have gone down, and they can pocket the difference. In 1955, onion futures became the most traded commodity on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, making up 20 of its trades. Two men, Sam Siegel and Vincent Kosuga, realized this and saw an opportunity. In the fall of that year, they bought literal tons of onions and onion futures until they controlled 98 of all onions in Chicago. By the end of the year, their combined amount of onions totaled £30 million. After cornering the market, Siegel and Kosuga started to short-sell onion futures. Typically, this would mean that they were betting that the price of onions would decline. Here, though, they weren't betting. They knew that if they started selling their ridiculous amount of onions, supply would dramatically increase and the price of the vegetable would plummet. So they did. What's more, when their previously purchased onions started to spoil, they sent them out to be cleaned and repacked. When they were shipped back, the large incoming shipments of what appeared to be new onions signaled incorrectly to futures traders that onions were in abundance. This only drove the price of onions even further down. While the two men made millions of dollars, the excessive amount of onions being shipped to Chicago caused shortages in the rest of the United States. Meanwhile, onions in Chicago were selling for 10 cents, a bag down from $2.75, bankrupting many farmers whose product was now worthless. Soon, the Commodity Exchange Authority got wind of Siegel and Kosuga's game and initiated an investigation while congressional hearings were held on the issue. In the end, the Commodity Exchange Act was amended to prohibit onion futures trading. The law is still in effect today, making onions the only banned trading commodity in the United States. Number 5. The woman who helped win World War. After World War I, damaged nations recuperating after significant losses cultivated expansionist agendas all over the world, setting the stage for a Second World War. Germany's loss of no less than 13 of its home territory, in particular, laid the groundwork for Adolf Hitler's eventual political takeover in the 1930s. In the midst of this international tension, one self-described capricious and cantankerous woman, Virginia Hall, was determined to become a player. During college, she became fluent in French, German, Italian, and Russian, and after graduation, she applied to the U.S. Foreign Service. Being a woman, however, she unfortunately didn't make the cut. Not to be discouraged, she instead traveled to Europe and began working as a clerk with various U.S. diplomatic institutions. During this period, she accidentally shot herself in the left leg while on a hunting trip, requiring amputation and a wooden replacement, which she lovingly named Cuthbert. Shortly after recovery, Hall applied to the US Foreign Service again, but was rejected once more, this time because of her new disability. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded its neighbor Poland from the north, south, and west, kick-starting World War II. Initially, Hall contributed to the war effort by driving ambulances for the French army, and in her off time, speaking passionately about Hitler's evils to her friends. A British spy, Vera Atkins, sometimes credited as the inspiration for James Bond's Miss Moneypenny, overheard one of Virginia's tirades and recruited her for a secret organization that was being organized by Winston Churchill, the Special Operations Executive, as part of the SOE. Hall soon demonstrated proficiency at living in disguise under a fake identity, recruiting loyal resistance spies, uncovering information about German movements, organizing drop zones, and facilitating jailbreaks. According to one report alone, she and her team killed 150 Nazis, captured several hundred more, derailed German freight trains, and detonated several bridges. At one point, her sabotage work became such an inconvenience for the Nazis that she was called the most dangerous of all Allied spies by the Gestapo, only known to them as the Limping Lady. She quickly climbed to the top of Germany's most wanted list. They never did catch her, however. Upon returning home after the war, Hall was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States Army. Her work was still not done. She continued to work for the Office of Strategic Services and then later for its successor, the Central Intelligence Agency, only leaving when she was required to retire at the age of 60. Today, visitors to the agency will find a field agent training facility named for the Limping Lady and a special section dedicated to her life and work in the agency museum. Notably, she is one of just 5 agents and the only woman to receive such an honor. Number 6. Chinese exclusion and resistance. Between 1850 and 1870, more than 200,000 immigrants entered the US from China. In response, Congress passed several acts to limit the further entrance of Chinese or other East Asians. First, the Page Act of 1875 barred undesirable immigrants such as Chinese women who engaged in prostitution, making it much more difficult for any Chinese or East Asian woman to enter the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 further banned all Chinese labor immigrants for 10 years, regardless of sex. Then, in 1892, after the 10-year period defined by the Chinese Exclusion Act came to a close, the Geary Act was passed. It renewed the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years and further required that all Chinese residents register for a permit as proof of residence by the next April. Violations of this law would be punishable by deportation or a year of penal labor. After another 10 years, the Geary Act would be renewed with no terminal date. Then, in 1892, after the 10-year period defined by the Chinese Exclusion Act came to a close, the Geary Act was passed. It renewed the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years and further required that all Chinese residents register for a permit as proof of residence by the next April. Violations of this law would be punishable by deportation or a year of penal labor. After another 10 years, the Geary Act would be renewed with no terminal date. A few months after the Act's passage, Chinese across the United States began to organize in resistance. From coast to coast, Chinese groups like the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association urged Chinese people to avoid registering and instead fundraise for legal representation. The law was unconstitutional, they claimed. By April 1893, the Act's deadline, only about 3,000 Chinese had registered out of an estimated 110,000 living in the United States. Many who refused to register did take legal action, and the issue appeared before the Supreme Court in Feng Yuting v. The court ruled in a 5-3 decision to uphold the law. In 1896, a second case brought before the court Wong Wing v. United States invalidated the imprisonment and forced labor penalties outlined in the Geary Act because they conflicted with the right to court and due process under the 5th and 6th Amendments. Ultimately, implementation of the Act became nearly impossible, as only about 14 of Chinese people throughout the country ever registered. Thus, the US government was left with the unforeseen task and cost of arresting and deporting upwards of 85,000 unregistered individuals. Though essentially moot, the Geary Act nonetheless remained in effect throughout the early 1900s until 1943, when Congress repealed all exclusion acts. Thanks for your time. Please don't forget to subscribe and like.